tonight on what is a much cooler night than we tend to expect. First I'd like to acknowledge we're meeting on Aboriginal land, sovereignty over this land is never ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thanks to Linda Scott in the middle, John Graham on the other side of David Shoebridge for coming along tonight to talk about the challenges and inquiry into regulating building standards and improving industry accountability in New South Wales. David Shoebridge is chairing the New South Wales Parliamentary Inquiry into Building Standards that was called in July after the Mascot apartment building was evacuated for building defects, which was the second building, as you know, following the Opal at Christmas time. John Graham is a Labour MP and he's also on this government inquiry, which has got 7 people on it. That includes David as chair, Robert Borzak from the Shoes and the Fishes as the deputy chair, and 2 Liberal, 1 National and 2 ALP EMPs, of which John is one. Linda, as well as being councillor on the City of Sydney, is president of the Local Government New South Wales, which is the peak body for New South Wales councils, and Local Government New South Wales was one of 165 submissions that were put into the inquiry, and I think that there were 9 individual council submissions in addition. The evacuation of the Opal Towers before Christmas was a shocking event and woke the government up to the real impact of risks already identified in the Shergold and Weir report from 2018. The Mascot evacuation added to the visibility and demands of the government to actually do something. The thing is, what to do had already been laid out in the Shergold and Weir report from April 2018, which was a commissioned report written by Professor Peter Shergold and Robin Weir that actually made 24 legislative recommendations to address known issues of the industry, and it outlined a suite of recommendations to mitigate these that included the registration of building practitioners and insufficient supervision, the need for better auditing and a need for better documentation. And one of the key issues identified by Peter Shergold that he actually blames for the overall failure was the lack of accountability of actual building designers, who are the people that the developer pushes the building design off to after using a named architect as a form of marketing for the building. And he says that actually was this part of the process that the Opal design was not peer reviewed and it was deficient. And actually before the Shergold report, there was the 2016 Lambert report, which was written by former Treasury Secretary Michael Lambert, and that at the time in 2016, the report was written in 2015, was considered overdue, and that made 150 recommendations into reform of the industry, and that was actually on the Building Professionals Act, which was the core legislation at the time governing building regulation in New South Wales. So the terms of reference for the inquiry that David's chairing actually includes a review of the implementation of the recommendations of these 2 reports, as well as the role of private certifiers in protecting building standards and the protection for building buyers of new apartments. And as you know, the terms of reference for a panel inquiry really where it leads on to, so it'll be interesting to hear from David, you know, what he's hearing in the submissions that actually reflect this and any things that have been coming from outside. There are obviously significant tensions in play about what needs to be done, which is obvious by the Shergold Weir report that it wasn't, the recommendations were not implemented in full, and the government, you know, leaves the risk to be addressed when the impact happens, which is a very typical way of how government operates across all areas nowadays, using a risk management approach instead of the precautionary principle, which is where you think up front what impact might be having and regulate against that rather than waiting for it to happen and then deal with it then. So for apartment owners, it's a lottery, obviously, the system as it is, that the perceived benefit of less cost up front through less regulation for all owners is then offset against a cost for some owners when the impact happens down the line, and that's obviously a tension because the developers will say that more regulation up front adds cost for all apartment owners rather than a little bit of cost for some down the track. Other tensions, and this is just off the top of my head, is between councils and the state, who would actually pay for the regulation and who manages it and who will cover it, because it would be quite a large impost for a council to be doing that. Then there's the tension between the past builds and future builds, and then there's insurances, like who would pay if they were better insured to, cover for damage in the future. And then there's the whole iceberg, which would be interesting to hear too, of the property owners who have not come out because they're protecting the investment that they've already got. And we're hearing a lot about that, the tension between fessing up and lowering perhaps the value of your apartment and contributing to improve the standards for future buyers. So New South Wales new Building Commissioner David Chandler, so the government's introduced a building commissioner, has already fronted the inquiry, and he said he sees the whole issue as a construction problem, not a regulation problem, and he has argued that the industry does not need further regulation. That is, the industry doesn't need further upfront costs. And he blamed the company, and it's an easy thing to do, you blame the individual company for the problems. He's blamed the company behind Mascot Towers, and that they were the ones who built, the building poorly. So planning peak body, PIA, and it's always interesting to see what the peak bodies say, and including what Local Government New South Wales has said. So the planning peak body has urged the New South Wales Government to consider restoring the checks and balances to maintain quality and community trust, so to put them back up front. But there is a worry that we actually don't have the skill now, or the expertise or the resources, because of the TAFE not churning out these people to actually put them in place, even if that is decided. So on that note, I hand it over to Linda first to talk about what next, all of them to talk about what next after the inquiry and the recommendations. So Linda's going to go first, then David, and then John. So where's the political will to improve things for apartment owners?
Just quickly, that was an extraordinarily comprehensive
meeting over.
I might stand because I'm even shorter than this, so it still feels like I'm sitting. But I too would also like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and say that we're very lucky that they had such good care and custodianship over our land for so long to leave us such a beautiful place. I also just apologise in advance. We have, of course, just painted our beautiful community centre, which is looking so shiny and lovely, but we've opened a door, and if you do start to feel kind of faint from the fumes, please let us know, and we will definitely open more, because I don't want you feeling ill. So it's that was a fantastic summary, thank you very much, and it is of course just this enormous, historic, multifaceted problem. Before I start though, I also want to acknowledge, I know there are people in the room, but particularly in these communities actually who have years of lived experience through this issue, whether it's fighting battles in their own building or for some of you knowing family and friends who've gone through these battles. It is a dreadful thing that has happened for obvious reasons. Some of you have been able to be public about this, but some of you have not, and I just want to acknowledge that there is an enormous amount of expertise I know in this room and in this area from communities that have been through the very difficult circumstances that it is to have a building with defects. I just want to paint you a picture as my first role on the City of Sydney, and then I'll move finally to the work that we've been doing at Local Government New South Wales on behalf of the state's councils. As an individual councillor on, one of the most well-resourced, most staffed councils in the state, the way that I hear about this issue is mainly through you contacting my office. So I will get a person call my office and say, listen, we're having this terrible situation. And often when people first discover a problem with their building, they just call the council, because people call the council for absolutely everything. Medicare, immigration, building defects, everything. And so we will chase up with the staff and try to get a bit of a response about what the council can do. Although often, as I'm sure many of you know too well, it is a point where a defect has been identified by people who have perhaps moved into a building or settled their property, the certifier has signed off, and so there's very little a council can do. We really have no power to make any decision, have any influence or play any regulation. The way that I found out about a range of the buildings, for example, in Erskineville, and just to give you context, I just live up the road in Newtown. My sister lived across the road from one of the buildings that was named. The way I found out about a range of the buildings with defects in Erskineville was through reading about it in the Sydney Morning Herald. So my council staff knew about it, but obviously they were bound by significant and important privacy regulations to not share with even the elected body politic of the council about the buildings that had defects. So literally, my sister lived in Ashmore across the road from the building, the row of terraces that continue to be vacant. I had absolutely no idea, like everybody else, had inquired with the council staff, why are these properties vacant? What's going on? Everyone's asking me questions about it, and they just got back to me and said, you know, there's an issue with the regulation. So just to paint you a picture as an elected council about the level of visibility we have over the problem. As a peak body though, we represent not only the state's local government elected representatives, but the staff. We represent the entire body. So we represent also the 55,000 staff that work in local government across the state. And so of course in that capacity, we actually have much more visibility, not of property by property or site by site, but of the enormous burden and problem this is for local governments, because of course we can get reports through staff networks about the issue that is facing their council. We have a huge policy making conference. We've got ours, we have an annual conference that's coming up in about a week, where we consider hundreds of motions from councils resolved across the state. And unsurprisingly, year after year after year, we know that this is an issue that continues to alarm and concern councillors, and they urge us as the peak advocacy body in the area to advocate to the state government to take more action to close loopholes that have clearly arisen in the lack of regulation around the building industry generally, be it certifiers, which has been most discussed in the media, or a range of other areas, regulating engineers, builders, etc. So we have taken a large amount of action on behalf of local governments and also their communities to advocate for change in this area. We have cautiously welcomed that the government, after many years of really doing nothing, has appointed a building commissioner. We see that as better than having not appointed a building commissioner. We met with him recently to have a long and detailed conversation about some of his plans. He was nervous about the small number of staff that he has. I'll leave these two to explain why that was. Just estimates an effective process. But, and he did explain he's looking forward to having a larger complement of staff. But he also went on to explain in more detail the kinds of processes he thinks the state should undertake in order to close a range of these very important loopholes. I could go on about all the details. Again, I'm conscious that people have you know, more individual experiences than I. But I want to say this. The government has put forward, this state government has put forward some models before, and I really acknowledge the point you made, Bronwyn, about the fact that there has been contention about,
Isabel.
Sorry, Isabel. Isabel made about the fact that the implementation of the former reports, of which there are a number, has not been implemented. For example, in a recent discussion paper prior to the appointment of the Building Commissioner, the government put forward 3 models for the regulation of the private certifier industry. Our board rejected them all, and we said that none of them had enough teeth, none of them would work in a way that would give enough certainty to actually communities and what they needed. So I want to tell you that the government are going to say, and they will continue to say, that they have taken steps to do these things. But I'm telling you, all the models they put forward, publicly, privately, they were weak, they were not with enough teeth to actually take action, and that's why these things have been comprehensively rejected by local governments and a range of other stakeholders. The second point to make is that there is a skills shortage, and it is real. And so there is always this fallback particularly for weak practitioners in a range of these industries, when they say, I actually won't be able to get insurance, and that means I can't practice, and that means you'll have these shortages, and people's construction on their homes won't be able to go ahead because you won't be able to have builders or engineers or certifiers. Those skills shortages are real. We have councils across the state in significant problems because they cannot find qualified skilled engineers, because our TAFE system is broken, etc., etc. So these things are real. However, that of course in no way means that you should continue to not regulate quality in these professions. Indeed, surely it is the strongest argument for doing so. When I met some time ago now the former planning minister, I said to him, Anthony Roberts said to me, listen, we can't do anything about certifiers because, they can't get insurance, we won't have any. I said, Anthony, once you take the people who are causing the problems out of the system, everybody's insurance premium comes down because the risk comes down, and then they can get assured again, and there's an affordable way forward. So I've never thought of that, Linda. So there are many arguments that are put forward to advance the cause of deregulation. There are many, many arguments that are put forward to make sure that there is not a tighter level of control over a range of building professionals, but they are not good enough. They are not strong enough reasons, and so local government's ridiculous.
Sorry, I should have said at the beginning that we have 8 minutes